You don't really see betrayal coming. That's the thing they don't tell you. It doesn't knock on your door or shout from across the yard. It sits quietly at your table, laughs at your jokes, pours you a drink, and then ruins your life when you're not looking. Back in the summer of '84, I thought I had it all. I had a decent job down at the mill, a small house with a porch I built with my own 2 hands, and a woman I'd loved since high school. Carol. God, she had a way of making everything feel okay, even when it wasn't. We weren't rich, but we had rhythm. We had routines, Saturday morning pancakes, beer on the porch at dusk. It was simple. It was enough. And then there was Tommy, my best friend since the 6th grade. If you'd asked me back then who I trusted most in this world, I'd have said Carol first, Tommy second. We'd been through everything together, scraped knees, bar fights, breakups, weddings, even buried my old man side by side. He was the kind of guy who could fix a car with a toothpick and a beer can. Loud, reckless, always smiling. People loved him, so did I. That summer, things felt a little off. Carol was quieter, more distant, said she was tired a lot. I chalked it up to stress. I was working overtime, trying to save up for a trip to the coast. Her dream, not mine, but I wanted to give her something she'd remember. Something different. Tommy was around more than usual, always helping with things I never asked for help with. Fixing the gutter, offering to mow the lawn, bringing over steaks just because. Looking back, I should have seen it. I really should have. But when you love people, really love them, your mind builds fences around the bad thoughts. You tell yourself, nah, not them, not her, not him. You lie to yourself because the truth is too damn ugly. I didn't catch them. Not then. There was no big discovery, no shouting match, just quiet erosion. I buried it, as men of my time were taught to do. Bottle it up, push through, be strong. It would be years before I found out what really happened. But the seed of suspicion was planted that summer. And though it lay dormant for decades, it never stopped growing beneath the surface. Funny thing is, when you give betrayal enough time, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes fuel. And I would burn slow, for years, until the day I bought the one thing that mattered most to Tommy. His damn house. After that summer, life kept moving, because that's what it does. Bills still came, birthdays still happened, and the coffee still brewed every morning like nothing was wrong. That's the cruel thing about routine. It covers cracks like fresh paint over rotting wood. Tommy eventually moved out of town. Said he got a job downstate, managing some construction crew. I didn't ask questions. I shook his hand and helped him load his truck, like a good friend does. Carol didn't say much when he left. In fact, she almost seemed relieved. I remember watching her from the porch as his taillights disappeared over the hill, her arms folded tight, her eyes locked on the road long after he was gone. For a while, things between us were better. Not perfect, but easier. She laughed more. We took that trip to the coast a year later, stayed in a rundown motel by the water. I remember waking up one morning and seeing her watching the waves through the window. She looked free, like a different woman. I held on to that image for a long time. I poured myself into work after that, took extra shifts, helped train new hires. They called me the old ox at the mill. Slow, but steady. I liked the name. It felt honest. I wasn't a complicated man. I wanted peace, a quiet life, a full dinner table. That was it. The house was aging, just like we were. I rebuilt the back fence after a storm knocked it flat in '88, dug the posts deeper, filled them with cement. I remember sweating through my shirt, dirt under my nails, and thinking, if I can just keep building, keep fixing things, everything will stay together. But it didn't. Not really. Carol grew colder again in the '90s. Our conversations thinned out. We shared more silence than words, and I told myself that was just marriage. The long road with worn tires. You don't stop loving someone overnight, but you do stop looking at them the same way. The day I found the letter was the day my faith finally cracked. It was buried in a box in the attic when I was looking for our old camping gear. A yellowed envelope addressed to her, postmarked 1985. From Tommy. I shouldn't have read it, but I did. He wrote about that summer, about how nothing ever felt more right, and how he'd never forget that night. My hands shook as I held it, the paper soft with time, the words still sharp. He called her my light. My light. I put the letter back. I never told her, never confronted her. What would have been the point? I had too much pride and too little left to save. I just let it sit inside me, like a nail under the skin. But that was the day I knew. Tommy had taken something from me. And maybe, just maybe, one day, I'd take something from him, too. You learn to live with certain weights. Some people carry guilt. Others carry grief. Me, I carried silence. A heavy kind that settles into your bones until you forget what it felt like to speak freely. After I found that letter, something in me broke, but it didn't shatter. It cracked, slow and quiet, like ice under a boot. And just like ice, I held. I didn't rage, I didn't accuse. I went downstairs, kissed Carol on the forehead, and asked her if she wanted eggs for dinner. That's how I handled it. Years passed. I became an expert at pretending. I smiled at church, paid my taxes, mowed the lawn. From the outside, we looked like every other couple on the block. Inside, though, I started to keep a distance. Not physical, emotional. I stopped asking her where she went. I stopped wondering who she texted when cell phones became a thing. I stopped caring about the answers because I already had the one that mattered. I wasn't enough. Not then, not now. She never knew I found the letter. At least, I don't think she did. But maybe she felt it. There were moments, short, strange pauses, where she looked at me too long, like she was waiting for something I wouldn't say. I always turned away first. By the time we hit our 40th anniversary, we were more roommates than lovers. I gave her a gold bracelet. She gave me a flannel shirt. We smiled for a photo. That was about it. Tommy, meanwhile, had gone quiet for decades. I didn't see him, didn't hear from him. I'd heard whispers. He moved back to the area sometime in the early 2000s. Divorced, no kids, bought a fixer-upper on the west side of town. Some people said he was drinking a lot. Others said he was sick. I never went looking, never crossed that invisible line we'd drawn between us. But I knew deep down that he was still out there, breathing, living, carrying nothing while I carried everything. Carol passed away in 2013. Lung cancer. She'd never smoked a day in her life. At least, not that I saw. I sat by her bed every day, held her hand, told her stories from when we were young. And when she was gone, I felt relief. That probably sounds cruel, but it's the truth. She took the lie with her. I took the silence with me. I was 67 when I stood alone in our house, the light filtering through the windows, just like it did in 1984. I looked at the spot where we used to dance in the living room. My knees hurt now, my back cracked, like dry wood. But my mind was clear. And I knew one thing with complete certainty. If the chance ever came, I would make Tommy pay. Not with fists, not with fury, but with something far more permanent. Ownership. It was a Tuesday, late spring. I remember because the robins were out. and the air smelled like wet grass and fresh mulch, the kind of smell that takes you back before you even know it. I was walking out of the hardware store, a bag of screws in one hand, when I saw him, Tommy, older, heavier, slower. His once thick blonde hair had thinned and gone gray. His back hunched a little. He wore an old bomber jacket, the kind he used to brag about back in the day, and a limp that I hadn't seen before. He didn't see me, but I saw him. He shuffled out of the liquor store next door, brown bag in hand, head down, like a man with no one left to impress. For a moment I just stood there, watching, measuring the weight of time on both our shoulders. And I smiled. Not out of happiness, out of something colder, something earned. Turns out, the rumors were true. He'd moved back a few years ago. Lost his contracting business after a failed job downstate, filed for bankruptcy, then picked up what he could, scraping together handyman work, and living alone in a beat-up craftsman house near the edge of town. The place was falling apart, roof caved in on the backside, yard grown out like a jungle. People said he barely left it, said he was a ghost of himself. I disagreed. He was exactly himself, just without the charm to hide behind now. I didn't go up to him that day, didn't speak. I wasn't interested in confrontation. I didn't want an apology or a fight. I wanted something far better. Leverage. I started checking property notices, quietly, carefully. I asked a buddy of mine who worked in city records if Tommy's place had liens on it. Turns out it did. Multiple. Back taxes, unpaid contractor bills, a foreclosure warning, already filed. It was coming. An auction. It felt surreal, like watching the world slowly tilt in my favor after decades of swallowing bile. I didn't feel joy. I felt readiness. There was no doubt in my mind I was going to buy that house, and I wouldn't do it with drama. No announcements, no revenge speeches, just a signature and a receipt. Because sometimes the sweetest justice doesn't come from screaming your pain. It comes from standing silently at the end, with the deed in your hand. I hadn't been to a property auction in over 30 years. The last time I did, I was helping my brother bid on a patch of hunting land upstate. Back then, I didn't have much to offer. I was just muscle and moral support. But this time, it was personal. I arrived early, not because I was eager, but because I needed to feel the space. The town courthouse hadn't changed much since the 80s. Same dusty wood trim, same echoing hallways, same old benches that creaked when you sat too fast. There were about 15 of us in the room. Most were younger investors, the types who wear sport coats over t-shirts and carry more ambition than cash. A few old-timers, too, probably sniffing around for a deal. I sat in the back, quiet. I didn't need attention. All I needed was one name on a clipboard and the number 9 pinned to my chest. Lot number 6 was Tommy's house. The auctioneer read through the legalese like he was reciting a grocery list. Back taxes owed. Outstanding liens. Property sold as is. Starting bid, $22,000. I knew the house was worth more. Structurally, it had good bones. But emotionally, it was a collapsed cathedral. The bidding started slow. One man offered $23,000. Another raised to $24,000. I waited. $25,000, I said, calm and clear. The room turned. A few heads looked my way. I didn't meet their eyes. I kept mine locked on the table. Silence. The auctioneer glanced around. "Do I hear 26? No one spoke. He raised the gavel. "Going once?" I took a deep breath, not out of nerves, out of finality. This was the moment, the quiet reward for decades of dignity swallowed. No fire, no confrontation, just going twice, sold. Lot number 6 to bidder number 9. My hand didn't even shake when I signed the paperwork. I walked out of that courthouse with a manila folder and a quiet satisfaction I can't describe. Not joy, not triumph, just settlement. I didn't buy the house to hurt him. I bought it to finish something, to reclaim a piece of my past that had been taken without permission. Tommy didn't even show up that day. Maybe he didn't know. Maybe he didn't care. But I did, and that was enough. Later that week, I drove by the house, now my house, for the first time since the sale. The grass was knee-high. A window was cracked. The porch sagged with the weight of time and rot. But it stood. And so did I. The first time I stepped into the house after the purchase, I did it alone. No contractors, no neighbors, no fanfare. Just me, a flashlight, and a key that still had Tommy's name on the tag. I turned it slowly in the rusted lock, and the door opened with a groan that sounded almost like it remembered me. The air inside was thick, not just with dust and mold, but with memory. This was his house, but I knew his habits too well not to see traces of him everywhere. The half-fixed coat rack by the door, the cracked photo frame on the hallway table with no photo left in it, a coffee mug on the kitchen counter, dried rings inside like fossilized routines. I stood in the center of the living room, that same hollow stillness you only find in places abandoned long before they were empty. The carpet was stained, the wallpaper peeling, but the bones were solid, just like Tommy had always been. Rough, worn, but impossible to knock down. I didn't walk the place like an investor. I walked it like a man who had been waiting 40 years for this exact moment. The back room, probably where he slept, was the worst. Cigarette burns on the floor, a mattress on the ground, blankets balled up like someone had left in a hurry or didn't care to make the bed. But on the nightstand, that's where I stopped. There was a photo, small, bent. I picked it up slowly. It was him and Carol, from the early 80s, no doubt. She was laughing, her real laugh, not the one she gave me at church or around company. Her head was leaned against his shoulder. His arm was around her waist. It was intimate, careless, real. I didn't break the frame. I didn't burn the picture. I simply placed it back, face down. Because this house wasn't a shrine. It was a tomb. I went outside and stood on the porch. The sun was setting behind the trees, casting long shadows across the overgrown yard. A few kids biked past on the street, not giving the place a second glance. Good. Let it rot in peace. I wasn't going to flip the house. I wasn't going to rent it. No, I had other plans. I had earned the right to let this place sit, vacant, quiet, undisturbed, just like the part of me that had been taken all those years ago. This wasn't revenge. It was preservation. And for the first time in 4 decades, I slept well that night. A week after I bought the house, I received a letter. No return address. Handwritten. The kind of envelope that feels heavier than its weight. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was shaky but familiar. A few words, barely more than a whisper. I know it was you, Tom. I stared at the note for a long time. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't angry. It was tired. like the last breath of a man who realized the clock had finally caught up with him. I folded it once, placed it in my coat pocket, and went about my day. But it echoed, because in that one sentence, Tommy had said more than he ever did in person. He knew, and that meant he was watching, or someone had told him. Word travels fast in small towns, faster when your sins are old, and the people who remember them are still alive. I didn't care. I had nothing to hide. I hadn't broken a law. I hadn't made a scene. All I had done was wait. And win. A few days later, I saw him. He was sitting on the bench outside the pharmacy. Same bomber jacket. Same gray eyes. Only this time they locked onto mine as I walked by. No words were exchanged. Just a look. Regret? Maybe. Bitterness? Probably. But mostly, recognition. He didn't stand. He didn't speak. He just watched me walk by, with the quiet acceptance of a man who knew that whatever was left to be said had already passed its due date. That weekend, I went back to the house. I brought a chair, an old cooler with iced tea, sat on the porch like it was mine, because it was. And for a few hours, I just watched the neighborhood. Kids playing, a couple arguing across the street, a dog barking behind a chain-link fence. Life went on, even when some of us had paused for decades. I don't know if Tommy drove by that day. I don't know if he ever planned to confront me, or if that letter was his final attempt at closure. But I knew one thing for certain. He didn't take this house from me. I took it back. And sometimes, that's all a man needs to feel whole again. Not revenge. Just resolution. It was a quiet Tuesday morning when the knock came. I was at the house, sweeping out the front hall. Not for any real reason, there was no one to impress, but I found comfort in the small rituals. They made the silence feel earned, not empty. The knock was soft, almost hesitant. I opened the door slowly, half expecting a city inspector or a curious neighbor. Instead, I saw Tommy's son. I hadn't seen Jack in over 30 years. He must have been in his late 40s now, with his father's jawline but his mother's dark eyes. There was a tightness to his face, like the words he was about to say had been rehearsed and maybe regretted, all at once. "Mr. Callahan," he said. It startled me a bit. I hadn't heard my full name in a while. "Jack," I replied, stepping out onto the porch. "Didn't expect to see you." He nodded. "I won't take much of your time. I wanted to ask if you'd be willing to sell the house. To me." I stared at him. For a second I thought it was a joke, but Jack looked dead serious, nervous, but determined. He cleared his throat. "My dad's not doing so great. He can't work much anymore. His place isn't safe to live in. I thought maybe, if I could buy this back for him, maybe he could have some dignity, finish things where he started." I looked past him, out to the street. A few cars rolled by. The wind rustled the overgrown bushes beside the porch. My grip tightened on the broom handle. "Jack," I said slowly, "do you know why your father lost this house?" He hesitated, then shrugged. Times got hard. He made some bad calls. Bad calls. That was putting it lightly. I wanted to say it. I wanted to tell him everything, the affair, the betrayal, the years I spent picking up the pieces of a life that Tommy helped destroy. But Jack wasn't part of that. He was a boy in the 80s. He had no idea. Still, I couldn't help but wonder, was he sent here, or did he come on his own? "I'm not interested in selling," I said finally. "Not now. Maybe not ever." Jack nodded like he expected it. He swallowed whatever pride he had left and managed a tight smile. "I understand," he said. Thought it was worth asking. As he turned to leave, I called after him. "Jack, Your dad ever tell you much about me?" He paused on the steps. "Not really. Just that you two used to be close. Said you were a good man." I nodded. He got that half right. And with that, he left. I stood there for a long while after he was gone. The air was heavy, not with anger, but with memory. Jack wasn't the enemy, but he wasn't getting this house either. This wasn't just a property. This was a scar I chose to keep. After Jack left, the house felt different. Not physically. It was still the same creaking floorboards, sagging roof, and the scent of old dust that lingered no matter how many windows I opened. But something had shifted in the air. It wasn't Jack's presence that got to me. It was what he didn't say, and what I didn't either. That evening I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee that had gone cold before I even took the first sip. The town was winding down. Porch lights clicked on one by one. Sprinklers turned lawns into misty mirrors. Somewhere, someone grilled something that reminded me of backyard barbecues, the kind Tommy and I used to have before it all fell apart. I thought about calling Carol, just once. Not to rekindle anything, not to demand apologies. I didn't even know if she was still alive, or where she'd ended up after she left town. But there was a part of me, a bitter, aging part, that wondered if she ever thought about what she did, what they did, what we all lost. I didn't pick up the phone. Instead, I went inside, pulled a dusty box from the closet, and started flipping through old photos, the kind that had yellowed edges and scribbled dates on the back. Most were harmless, fishing trips, birthdays, faded holiday dinners. But then I found one that hit harder than I expected. Tommy and me, mid-1970s, standing side by side, beers in hand, laughing like fools. My wife, then my wife, was in the background, blurred, but looking directly at us. I stared at that photo for a long time. What if I had seen it then, that look on her face? Admiring him, not me. Would it have changed anything? Probably not. We never see betrayal coming. We always think it happens in a moment. But really it builds, quietly, slowly, like mold under floorboards. By the time you smell it, it's already done the damage. I put the photo back in the box and shut it. No point digging for ghosts. But that night, as I lay in the back room on an old mattress I brought in, I heard a car roll past slowly. Headlights brushed across the window for a moment, then disappeared. My gut told me it was Tommy. He wouldn't knock, not now, maybe never. But he wanted me to know he was watching. That was fine. Let him watch. Because every time he drove by, he'd have to face the same truth I'd been carrying for 40 years. I rebuilt. He ran. And now, this house, this scar, was mine. A few days later, while clearing out the shed behind the house, I found something I hadn't expected. It was buried under a tarp, half covered in dirt and cobwebs. A heavy, rusted toolbox, the kind that once sat proudly in the back of every working man's truck in the 70s. And etched into the top, barely visible through the corrosion, were the initials, TB, Tommy Burns. I sat down on the creaky bench just outside the shed, the box in my lap, hands dirtier than they'd been in years. I hesitated to open it. Part of me didn't want to. Like the contents might whisper old memories I'd spent a lifetime trying to silence. But I did anyway. The hinges screamed in protest, but the lid came up. And inside? Well, it was a strange mix of the expected and the painful. Wrenches, tape, a hammer with a cracked handle, a few old receipts from hardware stores that probably didn't exist anymore. But beneath it all, tucked into the corner, was a folded photograph and a note wrapped around it with a rubber band. The photo showed Tommy and Carol, again, sitting on the hood of his old Chevy, probably around 1984. Her legs were crossed toward him. He was looking at her the way a man looks at someone he thinks he's going to spend his life with. And the note? It wasn't long, just a single sentence. "I'm sorry for what I ruined. I never stopped looking back." No signature, no date, just that. I held it for a while, reading and rereading those words, not because I needed to, but because I couldn't quite believe they existed. Had he written this recently? Back then, had he even meant it? It didn't matter. An apology this late might as well be an echo in an empty room. But I didn't throw it away. I placed it back in the toolbox and closed the lid. Not out of sentimentality, not because I forgave him, but because that toolbox, rusted, ugly, unwanted, was the perfect symbol for what we both became. Two men shaped by bad choices, living in the shadow of what could have been. Later that night, I left it on the porch. No lock, no note, just the box. And the next morning, it was gone. I never saw who took it. But I didn't need to. Some things don't need confrontation. Some endings are quiet. Like rust, like guilt. Like the sound of an old friendship fading into silence. That Friday, I went down to the old Veterans Hall for the first time in years. It wasn't planned. I'd passed the place on my way to the hardware store, saw the lights on, and something pulled me in. The lot was only half full. Most of the old crowd either dead, relocated, or too frail to make the trip anymore. Inside it still smelled like burnt coffee, varnish, and the ghost of cigarette smoke that had long since been outlawed but never really left. A few familiar faces looked up from the card tables. Some gave polite nods. Others stared like they weren't sure I was real. I found an open seat at the edge of the room, near the old jukebox. Broken, of course. Nothing here really worked the way it used to, and neither did we. Frank was there. Frank had been a medic in Nam, tough as nails then, tougher now with a pacemaker and a cane. He walked over, dropped into the seat across from me, and squinted like he was looking at a memory through fog. "Thought you were dead," he said. "Close enough," I replied. "How's the ticker?" "Still ticking, barely." He poured us both some weak coffee and said nothing for a while. We didn't need to. There's a kind of silence that only men with shared regrets can sit in comfortably. Eventually, Frank leaned back and said, "Heard you bought Tommy's place." So word had spread. I didn't answer, just raised my cup like a toast and drank. Frank smirked. "That takes a special kind of nerve." "It's just a house." "No," he said. "It's that house. Big difference." He wasn't judging me. If anything, there was admiration in his voice. Maybe a little understanding, too. Guys like Frank had lived through enough to know that revenge isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a quiet reclaiming. "You planning to stay?" he asked. "Not sure. Been fixing it up, piece by piece." He nodded. "Well, if you ever need a hand, or someone to drink with who can't hear well enough to interrupt, you know where I am." We clinked paper cups. That night when I got back to the house, I sat on the porch and watched the street again. Only this time, I didn't feel like a man guarding a grave. I felt like a man rejoining the world, slowly, awkwardly, but surely. The past wasn't gone. It never would be. But maybe, just maybe, I could build something new on top of it. Not out of spite, but out of survival. It was just after sunset when I heard it. 3 slow knocks on the front door. I'd been reading in the living room, a lamp casting just enough light to make out the faded words of an old Western paperback. The house had settled into its usual creaks and pops for the night. But that knock cut through it like a razor. I stood up slowly, joints protesting, and made my way to the door. When I opened it, I expected no one. Maybe a kid pulling a prank, or the wind slamming a loose shutter. But standing there, wearing a jacket 2 sizes too big and holding something in his hands, was Tommy. He looked older than the last time I'd seen him, older than me somehow. His face was sunken in places that used to carry a smile. His posture had lost its confidence, but his eyes, those same gray eyes, still held a storm. "Hey," he said, voice dry like gravel. I didn't respond right away. I could have slammed the door, could have cursed him out, could have laughed. But I didn't. I just opened it wider and stepped aside. He entered like a man stepping onto holy ground, like he wasn't sure he was allowed. I led him to the porch, where 2 chairs sat facing the quiet street. We both lowered ourselves into them slowly, careful not to look each other in the eye too quickly. For a while, we sat in silence. Then finally he said, "You found the box." "I did. I left that photo in there years ago, buried it, thought I'd buried everything." "You didn't." "No," he said, "I didn't." He stared out into the dark, then held out what he'd brought, a small wooden plaque, carved by hand. On it was a single word: "Sorry." It was clumsy, crude, uneven, but it was real. "I made it after she died," he said. I turned to him, eyebrows raised. "Carol," he said softly. "Cancer, 5 years ago. She asked for you at the end, said she'd wronged 2 men, not just one." I felt something in my chest twist, not pain, not grief, just the echo of something I didn't know I still carried. "She really loved you, you know," he added, "even after it all." I didn't answer. I couldn't, because no matter how many years pass, some things still sit too deep to dig out in one evening. We sat in silence again. The streetlights buzzed. A cat darted across the road. Somewhere in the distance, wind chimes whispered into the night. "Why now?" I finally asked. Tommy sighed. "Because this house, it was never just yours or mine. It was where everything started, and where I guess it had to end." I didn't say I forgave him, and he didn't ask. But when he stood to leave, he placed the plaque gently on the porch rail, nodded once, and walked off into the dark. And I let him go. Not because he deserved it, but because I did. The next morning I stared at that wooden plaque for a long time. Sorry. Such a small word for a wound that had shaped the better part of my life. I ran my fingers across the rough edges, felt the imperfections in every letter. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't polished, but maybe that was the point. None of us were. I took it inside and placed it on the mantel above the cold fireplace, not as a trophy, not as forgiveness, just as a marker, a reminder that some things get spoken too late, but still matter anyway. Later that day, I went up to the attic. It was the one place I hadn't touched since I moved back in. The door groaned on the hinges, and the pull-down ladder resisted me like it knew what was coming. The air up there was heavy with dust and the stale scent of insulation. But as I climbed, I felt something shift inside me, a kind of readiness. The light bulb flickered weakly as I pulled the chain. Stacks of old boxes lined the walls. Some were labeled Christmas, tools, Carol's things. I hesitated at that last one. It was a plain cardboard box, taped shut, marked in her neat handwriting. I sat down on an old trunk and opened it. Inside were photographs, some of us in younger years, smiling like the world hadn't yet turned on us. There was a worn leather-bound journal, her handwriting swirling across the pages, and a small wooden jewelry box. I opened the journal first. She'd written about everything, birthdays, ordinary days, even the affair. It was all there, her guilt, her confusion, her fear of losing herself. But what struck me most wasn't her regret. It was her longing to be heard. One line stayed with me. I wish he'd ask why I did it, not just how. I closed the journal, heart heavier than it had been in years. Then I opened the jewelry box. Inside were 2 rings, hers and mine. The ones we had exchanged back in 1965, before the lies, before the pain. I hadn't even noticed mine was missing when I left. She must have taken it off my dresser after I packed up and walked out all those years ago. At the bottom of the box was a tiny Polaroid of us, smiling in front of the house. This house. She'd written on the back, where everything began. Maybe one day it will begin again. My eyes stung, not from the dust, from something far older. I closed the lid, took the box downstairs, and for the first time since stepping foot back into this house, I didn't feel like a trespasser in my own past. This was my home again, pain and all. The county office was colder than I remembered. Not the temperature, but the atmosphere. Gray walls, gray suits, gray faces buried in stacks of paperwork. Bureaucracy had no time for nostalgia. I was there for one reason, to get the full history of the property purchase. I hadn't needed the details at the time. I'd shown up at the estate auction, placed my bid, and walked away the new owner of Tommy's house. But now, I wanted to know everything, not just what I'd won, but what he had lost. The clerk was a woman in her 50s, sharp-eyed and efficient. When I told her the address, she paused. "That place went fast," she said. "Unusual for a foreclosure case. You were lucky?" "Wasn't luck," I replied. She raised an eyebrow but didn't push. She brought out a thick folder labeled with the parcel number. Inside were transaction histories, liens, foreclosure notices, court documents. A paper trail of desperation. I sat at a side table and read through every page. It painted a bleak picture. Tommy had refinanced the home twice in 10 years. Once to cover medical debt, and again, years later, to invest in a business that never took off. Missed payments, warnings, final notices. He tried renting it out for a time, but even that didn't help. The man who once slept with my wife in this very house was now begging banks not to take it from him. And they did anyway. The auction had been a quiet affair. No family to step in, no friends to bid against me. Just one name on the deed. His. By the time I closed the folder, something in me had shifted again. Not pity, not satisfaction, just a kind of clarity. He hadn't just lost a house. He'd clung to it for years, perhaps believing it could redeem him. That the walls could hold back the guilt. That staying would prove something. To me, to himself, to Carol, maybe even to God. But houses don't forgive. They just outlive us. I returned the folder to the desk and thanked the clerk. As I stepped outside, the sun hit me in the eyes. Blinding, honest light. I stood there for a while, long enough to realize that revenge doesn't always come as a firestorm. Sometimes it arrives like a mirror, and when you look into it, you don't see your enemy burning. You see yourself, still standing, still alive, still rebuilding. I hadn't seen Eddie in nearly 30 years. He'd been just a lanky teenager the last time I laid eyes on him. All hair gel, ripped jeans, and misplaced confidence. Tommy's boy, the spitting image, minus the cruelty in the eyes. At least, that's how I remembered him. So when he knocked on my door late one afternoon, I didn't recognize him at first. "Mr. Clark?" he asked, unsure. I nodded. "I don't know if you remember me. I'm Eddie, Tommy's—" "I know who you are." He looked relieved, but only slightly. There was tension in his posture, the kind you see in people who've already had too many doors closed in their faces. "Can I come in?" I considered it, then stepped aside. We sat in the kitchen. I offered him coffee, which he accepted even though it had probably been sitting in the pot since sunrise. He didn't say anything for a while, just held the mug like it might warm more than his hands. Then finally he said, "My dad's gone." I paused, letting the words settle. "When?" "Last week. Heart failure. He'd been sick for a while but didn't tell anyone, not even me. Just dropped dead on his porch." The same porch where, not long ago, Tommy had placed that crooked wooden plaque. The apology no one heard but me. "I didn't know," I said, and I meant it. Eddie nodded. "You bought the house?" It wasn't a question. "Yes." He looked around the kitchen, at the walls, the fixtures. "You remodeled. Looks different." It had to. There was silence again. Then Eddie leaned forward slightly. "Can I ask you something?" I said nothing, just waited. "Why did you buy it?" He wasn't accusing, he was curious, maybe even hopeful, like he was looking for a story that could rewrite the ending he knew. I could have told him the truth. That his father betrayed me. That I spent decades carrying the weight of another man's choices. That buying this house was the final chapter of a book I never wanted to read again. But I didn't. Instead, I said, "Because I needed a place to come home to." He nodded slowly, like he understood more than I gave him credit for. "Dad always said this place meant something to you," he said, "even before everything went wrong." "It did." Eddie set his mug down and stood up. "Well, I just wanted to say thank you for not trashing it, for keeping it standing." He walked to the door, hesitated, then added, "He talked about you near the end, said he wished things had gone different." I didn't respond, because wishes don't change the past, but maybe they soften the way we carry it. He left without asking for anything, no favors, no inheritance claims, just a son trying to stitch together a memory of a father he never fully understood. And me? I sat back down at the kitchen table, alone with my silence. Sometimes that's the loudest thing in the room. A few weeks after Eddie's visit, I decided to finally inspect the crawl space behind the kitchen wall. The house was old, and old houses hold secrets. I'd delayed this part of the renovation, partly out of laziness, but mostly because part of me wasn't ready to face whatever this house still had buried within it. I wasn't superstitious, not really, but this place, it felt alive in a way that made the silence echo louder. The drywall came down easier than expected. Decades of dust exploded into the air, and behind the insulation, there it was. The narrow crawl space, untouched since the 60s or 70s. I had to crouch to get in. My knees weren't built for spelunking anymore, but I was too far in to care. I brought a flashlight and swept the beam across the dark. Boxes, old boxes, stacked and covered with cobwebs, a small trunk, rolled carpet, and something else, a scorched patch of wall, blackened and brittle. Char marks licked up the studs, like the memory of a flame. Someone had put out a fire here, and not just metaphorically. I dropped to one knee and ran my fingers along the soot. It hadn't been recent. This was old, forgotten, never reported, never repaired, but it had burned long enough to matter. Inside one of the nearby boxes, I found what looked like old insurance paperwork, scorched around the edges, like they'd nearly gone up in smoke, too. One paper stood out. A letter addressed to Carol, never opened. It was dated 1987, the year she left me. I hesitated. Something in my gut twisted, but I opened it. It wasn't from Tommy. It was from a realtor, a man offering to help her secure a clean exit strategy. It mentioned selling the house quickly, cash offers, and a note. If your husband won't sign, we can apply pressure elsewhere. My jaw clenched. So it hadn't just been an affair. It had been a plan, a setup. She'd wanted out. Not just from me, but from everything. From this home, from the life we'd built. And maybe Tommy had talked her out of it. Or maybe he hadn't. Either way, it explained a lot. It explained why the kitchen remodel in '87 had suddenly stopped. Why she never fought to keep the house in the divorce. Why she left so quietly. I sat back, heart pounding. And for a moment, I felt like I was 40 again, staring at the ruin of everything I thought I understood. But I wasn't 40 anymore. I was 78. And I'd lived long enough to know this. The fire doesn't destroy everything. It just reveals what was already rotten. I carefully packed the letter back up and carried it outside. I didn't need it, not anymore. I burned it in the fire pit out back, watched the flame catch, watched it die, and for the first time in a long, long time, I didn't feel angry. I just felt clean. I wasn't looking for it. Sometimes the most painful truths aren't uncovered through obsession. They just show up, quietly, unexpectedly, like a whisper you almost miss. I was cleaning out the hallway closet, dusty shelves, stacked with forgotten paint cans, old photo albums, mismatched linens, and one box marked MISC 1983. I nearly skipped it. But curiosity won. Inside were mostly old receipts, tax documents, and a few manuals for appliances that hadn't worked in decades. But buried under all that was a Polaroid photo, curled at the edges and yellowed from time. It showed Carol and Tommy sitting side by side on a red and white checkered blanket at some picnic. She was laughing, her hand resting casually on his knee. He was looking at her like she was the only person on earth. They weren't doing anything overtly scandalous, but it was there. The look. That intimacy you only share when the world around you disappears. On the back, in Carol's handwriting, Mount Pleasant, July '83, one of the best days. I stared at it for a long time, not out of shock. That part of the pain had passed, but because of what that date meant. July 1983, we were still married, still sharing a bed, still planning our 20th anniversary trip to Oregon. I thought everything was stable, normal, happy. Turns out that was the month the cracks first split open. I don't remember what I was doing that day. Probably mowing the lawn, fixing a leaky faucet, trusting the wrong people with everything that mattered to me. I thought about Eddie again. He'd seemed so open, so eager to build something better than what his father left behind. Did he know about this day? About this moment? Probably not. Some legacies don't pass down. And maybe that's a blessing. I didn't tear the photo up. I didn't burn it. I didn't do anything dramatic. I simply put it back in the box and slid it back onto the shelf. Because I'm not rewriting history. I'm just learning to live with it. That's the hardest part about being old. You don't get to forget. You carry it all. The weight of what was done, what was lost, and what will never be said out loud. You carry it because no one else will. And yet, life goes on. I finished the closet. I painted the shelves. I labeled the boxes. And then I sat on the front porch as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the yard. In the silence, I thought about how love can rot in secret, and how betrayal doesn't always wear a villain's face. Sometimes it smiles, sometimes it laughs on a picnic blanket. But that day was no longer mine to mourn. The last time I saw Carol was in a grocery store parking lot, sometime in the early 2000s. It wasn't anything cinematic. No thunderclap, no swelling music, no confrontation. Just an old man loading paper towels into the back of his truck. And a woman I once loved walking toward her car with a bag of oranges. She didn't see me. Or maybe she did, and just didn't want to. Her hair had gone gray by then, pulled back in a bun. She walked a little slower than I remembered, with a stiffness in her left leg. Time had touched her, like it touched us all. Gently at first, then with more certainty. I stood there, frozen in a moment that felt too big and too small all at once. Should I say something? What would I even say? "Hi, Carol. Long time. Remember when you slept with my best friend and shattered my entire sense of trust for the next 2 decades? Or maybe, "Hey, hope the oranges are sweet. I've finally started sleeping through the night again." But no, I just watched. She opened the driver's side door, paused to adjust her grip on the bag, and looked around for a moment, as if she'd forgotten something. Her eyes passed right over me, not a flicker of recognition, and in that moment, I realized she had let go of me long before I ever let go of her. She got in, started the engine, and pulled out of the lot. No hesitation, no rear-view glance, and just like that, she was gone again. It should have hurt, but it didn't. I got back in my truck, sat in the driver's seat for a while, and watched people go about their business. A young couple arguing over coupons, an older man reading labels on vitamin bottles, a little girl licking a melted popsicle. Life was happening, moving forward, unbothered by the ghosts that haunted my lungs. I went home and didn't tell anyone about seeing her. Not my daughter, not my brother, not even the dog. It was mine. That moment. Quiet and unremarkable. But it was the final page in a chapter I didn't know I was still writing. Because here's the truth no one wants to admit when you're older. Closure doesn't come like a wave. It comes like dust, settling slowly until you realize the room feels still. And that's what I felt after that day. Not peace exactly, but stillness. I never saw her again. But I stopped looking over my shoulder after that, and sometimes that's more than enough. It was about a year after I bought his house when I heard the news. Tommy had passed away. No fanfare, no obituary in the Sunday Times, just a brief announcement in the local paper. Thomas L. Carter, 83, no services held at his request. A quiet end for a man who once filled every room he entered like a firecracker. I sat at my kitchen table, the paper folded in half, coffee cooling beside it. I read that tiny paragraph over and over again, as if some hidden message would appear if I stared long enough. But there wasn't one, just his name, his age, and silence. He died alone. That was what struck me most. We hadn't spoken in decades. After Carol left, he disappeared from my life. Moved to another part of the state, remarried for a while, got divorced again. His son, Eddie, barely spoke of him unless pressed, and even then it was with a tight jaw and tired eyes. I asked Eddie once casually, "How's your old man?" His answer had been simple. Still angry, still broke. Now he was gone. No legacy, no laughter, just an empty house that had become mine. You'd think I'd feel vindicated, that the man who betrayed me, who helped unravel my marriage and our friendship, getting swallowed by time, would feel like justice. But it didn't. It felt small, unfinished, like a bell that never fully rang. So I did something I hadn't done in years. I drove to the cemetery where I knew his parents had been buried. I figured maybe, just maybe, they'd placed a stone there for him too. There was nothing, just the old Carter's grave. His mom and dad, buried side by side, beneath a weeping cherry tree that had seen better days. I stood there a long time, hands in my coat pockets, wind tugging gently at my sleeves, and I spoke. Not to the Carters, not to God, just to Tommy. I told him I'd bought his house. I told him I'd fixed the roof, sanded the floors, painted over the water stains he'd never bothered to repair. I told him Eddie was doing all right, that his kid was smarter than both of us and didn't need his anger. I didn't curse him, didn't spit, didn't rehash the betrayal, because the truth is, at some point, revenge curdles into something worse than the original hurt. It becomes a second life you have to carry, and I didn't want to carry him anymore. So I let the wind take my words, and I walked away from that grave like it was the end of a story, not with fire, not with rage, but with release. For the first time, it really felt over. Some nights, after the house was quiet and the dog snored gently by the fireplace, I'd sit at my old roll-top desk with a glass of rye and a pen in hand, and I'd write to her, to Carol. I never mailed a single one. Maybe I wrote them for me. Maybe I wrote them for the version of her that still lived in my memories, younger, laughing, barefoot on the back porch with a glass of sweet tea in one hand and my heart in the other. Some letters were angry. Others were soft, like a slow song you don't realize you're humming until it breaks your heart. But one night, I wrote one that I remember word for word. Dear Carol, it's been 35 years since the day you walked out with your suitcase and didn't look back. I used to think I'd never forgive you. Some days I didn't want to. Some days, hate was the only weight that kept me anchored. But hate gets heavy, and after a while you don't remember why you're carrying it, just that it's all you have left. I bought Tommy's house, you know. You probably never knew it went to auction. He let it rot from the inside, mold in the basement, cracked tiles, peeling paint, fitting, I suppose. I fixed it all up, not for revenge, not to spit on his memory. I just wanted to turn something broken into something whole again. He's gone now. I stood over his grave and didn't feel anything, not rage, not grief, just quiet. He left nothing behind but dust and silence. Funny how a man can cause so much damage and vanish without a trace. You and I, we had good years before the bad ones. I've stopped pretending otherwise. There was love, Carol, and I hope you remember that, too. Before the lies, before the distance. There was a summer once where you fell asleep in my lap at the lake, and I thought, I'll never need anything else in this world. That boy didn't know what was coming, but he meant it. I don't need anything from you, not explanations, not apologies. I've made my peace. I hope wherever you are, you've found a little of yours. Robert. I folded it, slid it into an envelope, and tucked it into the bottom drawer with all the others. Never stamped, never sealed. Just there. Proof that I had more to say, even if no one would hear it. The funny thing is, writing them didn't make me feel better, but not writing them, that would have made me feel worse. So I wrote, and I moved on, inch by inch, word by word, because sometimes the only way to heal is to speak into the silence, even if no one ever answers back. The auction wasn't the thunderclap people expect in revenge stories. No dramatic reveal, no gavel-slamming moment of justice, just a cloudy Thursday, a sagging tent in a half-abandoned cul-de-sac, and a line of strangers who didn't know what kind of ghosts they were bidding on. I'd heard about the foreclosure months before. Tommy had defaulted. Eddie didn't want the house, didn't want the memories or the debt. Can't say I blamed him. I showed up wearing the same coat I'd worn to my daughter's college graduation. It still smelled faintly of pipe smoke and old books. I didn't want to look like someone chasing revenge. I wanted to look like what I was, a man who'd lived long enough to wait for life to come back around. There were only 4 bidders, a couple of property flippers, a woman who wanted to turn the place into a short-term rental, and me. I didn't say a word, just nodded when my number was called, raised my hand at the right times. No one knew the house like I did. I knew where the floorboards creaked. I knew the garage door never shut right unless you leaned into it. I even knew the patch in the backyard where the grass never grew, where he'd once buried the dog he and Carol had owned during the affair. The bidding started slow. I stayed calm. Let the others wear themselves out, and then, at just the right moment, I made my move. 1 clean bid, more than the house was worth, less than what I was willing to pay. Silence. Then the auctioneer nodded. Sold. That was it. No applause, no music, no lightning from the sky, just paperwork. A deed, and a key to a house that had once nearly ruined me. When I walked inside for the first time as the owner, the air was stale. The carpets reeked of mildew. The walls were yellowed with age and neglect. But underneath the grime, I saw it. My past. The cracks. The rot. The echoes. But also, a new beginning. I didn't tear the place down. I didn't burn it. I rebuilt it, floor by floor, wall by wall, not because I wanted to erase the history, but because I wanted to write the ending on my terms. And every time I sanded a beam or painted over a stain, I felt lighter. Not vengeful, not vindicated, just free. Owning that house didn't fix everything, but it gave me something I didn't know I needed. Closure made of wood and nails, peace that creaked softly under my feet. And in the silence of that old house, I finally heard something I hadn't in decades. Myself. It took me nearly a year to finish the house. Not because it needed that much work, though it did, but because I wasn't in any rush. Every weekend, I'd take the short drive from my place to Tommy's old house with a thermos of coffee, a box of tools, and the kind of focus you only develop after losing too much to distraction. I worked alone, no contractors, no helpers, just me, an aging man with a mission, not of revenge, but of restoration. And when it was all done, when the walls were repainted, the creaky stairs reinforced and the front porch rebuilt from scratch, I did one last thing. I built a room just for me. Not a bedroom, not an office, just a quiet, small space tucked into the back corner of the 2nd floor. It had a wide window that looked out over the yard and the crooked apple tree still standing after all these years. I put in a rocking chair, a shelf for books, a record player I'd rescued from a thrift store and repaired myself. The walls I painted a soft, smoky gray. The floor I left raw oak, no rugs, no clutter. It became my room of peace. Funny how the world doesn't often give men spaces to feel. We're taught to fix, to fight, to carry. But that room, it asked nothing from me. And one morning as I sat there watching the autumn leaves swirl and fall outside, I caught myself smiling. It wasn't a bitter smile, not the smirk of a man who got even. No, it was something softer, a quiet kind of victory. I had taken back what had been stolen from me all those years ago. Not by force, not with bitterness, but with patience, with purpose, with persistence. Carol was gone. Tommy was gone. Even the rage I once carried was gone. But I remained. And so did that house. I didn't move into it permanently. I had no need. But I kept it. Sometimes my daughter would visit and bring the grandkids. They'd run through the halls, shrieking with laughter, unaware of the pain those walls once held. And maybe that's what healed it in the end. Laughter in a place once filled with betrayal. Light where there was once only rot. They say forgiveness is for the forgiver. I think they're right, but sometimes healing isn't loud. It's not dramatic or cinematic. Sometimes it's just a man in a quiet room with the past finally laid to rest and a future still worth waking up for. The leaves had started falling again. It was late October, cool and gray, the kind of day that made your bones ache in the morning but your heart settle by noon. I hadn't been back to the house in months, not since the summer, but something pulled at me. Not guilt, not nostalgia, something else. I packed a lunch, my old flannel jacket, and a photograph. It was the only picture I had left of the four of us. Me, Carol, Tommy, and my daughter Emily as a little girl. Taken in '83. At a barbecue. Everyone smiling, squinting into the sun. That picture used to make me sick. For years I kept it buried in the back of a drawer. But I'd started looking at it differently. Maybe because now I could see what I hadn't then. That the smiles weren't perfect. That Carol's hand was just a little too far from mine. That Tommy's eyes were on her when they shouldn't have been. It wasn't a happy photo. It was a warning. One I'd missed. I unlocked the house. It smelled faintly of cedar and old pages. The air was cold. No heat had been turned on yet. But it still felt warmer than it used to. Familiar. Tamed. I made my way to my room, the small one at the back with the wide window and the rocking chair. I sat, placed the photo on the windowsill, and stared out at the apple tree that had somehow survived 4 decades of storms. The house had changed. I had changed. I'd come a long way from the man who once collapsed on his garage floor after learning the truth. From the man who drowned his fury in silence for decades. And yet, part of me was still that man, still wondering how things might have turned out if I'd fought harder, if I'd left earlier, if I'd never looked the other way. But those questions didn't haunt me the way they used to. Now they just floated, like dust in a quiet room, visible, present, but harmless. I stayed in that chair for hours, watching the light shift, watching the memory of a younger me fade with the day. When I finally stood, I took the photo, folded it carefully, and tucked it into a drawer in the nightstand. Not to forget it, but to put it away for good. That was the last time I visited the house. I didn't need it anymore, not as a project, not as a symbol. I had taken what I needed from it, not bricks or boards, but closure. And I had given it something in return, forgiveness. I sold the house a year later, not because I needed the money, I didn't. And not because I regretted owning it, I didn't. I sold it because I no longer needed the past to be tangible. It had finally become what it was always meant to be, a memory, not a monument. The new owners were a young couple with a toddler. She was pregnant again. They smiled a lot, the kind of smiles that still believed in forever. I didn't warn them about the ghosts. There weren't any left. Before I handed over the keys, I returned to the house. One last time. It was empty, echoing. The rocking chair was gone, the bookshelves bare. But in the center of that quiet house was something I had never expected to leave behind. Peace. I walked through every room. I touched the banister Tommy had once leaned on. I opened the cupboard where Carol used to hide her favorite snacks. I ran my hand along the living room wall where Emily had taken her first steps. And then in the small back room, my room, I stood at the window one final time. The apple tree had lost most of its leaves. The yard was quiet. The light was soft. I smiled, not because I had won, not because I had gotten even, but because I had survived. They say time heals all wounds. That's a lie. Time just gives you space to choose how the story ends. I chose to end mine, Not with bitterness, but with grace. Carol passed in '06, Tommy in '09. I went to neither funeral. But I grieved them in my own way, slowly, quietly, without ceremony. I forgave them, not because they asked, but because I refused to carry their betrayal with me another mile. And Eddie, well, he turned out all right. Better than all right. He visits every Sunday, brings my grandkids, calls just to talk. He never knew the full story. I never told him what his father had done, or what I had done in return. That revenge. It wasn't about destruction. It was about reclamation, of dignity, of choice, of peace. I still walk every morning, still drink my coffee black, still sit on the porch and watch the world go by. I'm not angry anymore, not sad, just content. And when my time comes, and it will, I hope someone remembers this. That man lived through betrayal, but he didn't let it define him. He rebuilt, he forgave, and in the end, he was free.